Welcome, everyone. We're just gonna wait for a few more people to enter. All right, that might be it for right now. So welcome, everyone, to our MPH conversation, Anxiety on the Rise. We are so blessed to have Barb Shepard here. She's a local licensed mental health counselor. She has been indispensable for me as a professional to be able to talk with someone about what is going on with our current student lives, but also she is also a therapist to some of our students, and it's just been wonderful for them. We are just so welcome to have her, especially because she is due in 3 weeks with her first baby. So congratulations, Barb. And so how we'll do this is Barb will give her presentation, and then if you have questions, please put them in chat, and then at our Q&A time, I will present those questions to Barb. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we'll have an opportunity to have follow-up with your questions later. So thank you very much. And Barb, you may have the floor or screen.
Green, yes. Thank you for having me. So as Joy mentioned, my name is Barb Shepard, and I have a private therapy practice in Fayetteville. I specialize in working with anxiety disorders. I see a lot of teens and families at my practice. And this year, I'm sure it's no surprise, has really been a difficult year for a lot of our teens and parents. So this topic is ever relevant. I actually gave this presentation last year talking about anxiety on the rise. And so a lot of this is still the same in some ways, but there's also a lot of new information too, just pertaining to how our world has changed. So we'll jump right in. So a question I get a lot is, are teens today really more anxious now than in the past? So people wonder, is this just because teens talk about it more? Is this something that's more normalized and that's why we're hearing more about it? Some of that is true, but there actually is a lot of research that shows that teens are more anxious. They are being diagnosed more frequently with anxiety disorders. And especially again, this year, a lot has emerged pertaining to that. So in order to really answer that question, there's kind of 4 different categories that we'll talk about. So the first is recognizing the signs of an anxiety disorder versus normal, I prefer the word typical experiences of stress, because what is normal? But there are some things we can expect to happen for teens as they grow, as they develop, and also ourselves as just being human. So I think it's really important to differentiate over pathologizing versus just identifying what we can expect from normal teenage development. The next thing we'll talk about is why teens are more anxious today than in the past. So we'll discuss some of those reasons. And then the things that I'm sure you're all anxious to hear about, how parents can best support their teens with anxiety, and also how therapy can help with those things. So what is anxiety? We hear this word a lot, and it kind of gets a bad connotation. So I always like to start by identifying what exactly anxiety is and whether it's actually all bad. So the reality is we all have anxiety and stress at times. This is part of being human. It's actually necessary to help keep us safe. So a healthy dose of anxiety actually helps us just function in the world. So it helps us complete important tasks, make good decisions, and it motivates us. So I often give the example, like, let's say you're walking down the street and a car runs a stop sign or a red light and you have to jump out of the way. Your stress hormones go up, your pupils are dilating, your heart is pounding. All of that helps you to make a quick decision to keep you safe. And that is part of anxiety and stress. We need that to live, to survive. If we never felt anxiety or stress, we would just accomplish nothing. We wouldn't be able to make good decisions. So I like to have a well-rounded definition of anxiety and recognize that like we need a little bit of this to actually function in our day-to-day. So anxiety becomes problematic in certain cases. And the statistics, according to the National Institute of Health, are that 1 in 3 adolescents ages 13 to 18 will experience an anxiety disorder. And since 2007, these disorders have increased by 20%. That's a pretty big number, and 1 in 3 is a lot of kids. That is not a small number. We've also seen hospital admissions for suicidal teens double in the past decade. And that's, again, a huge number. That can be related to a lot of different things regarding depression or mood disorders or, other types of mental health issues. But what hospitals often see is kids or adults go to the ER with panic attack symptoms, and they feel like something is wrong with them physically, or there might be some other type of emergency they think is happening. And then when they get this clean bill of health, they end up in my office because we're then dealing with the panic symptoms. So essentially, to answer the first question, is anxiety really on the rise? Yes, it is. And it's affecting a lot of our teens in a really big way. So let's talk a little about how to differentiate between appropriate anxiety. So again, this kind of typical, more normal stuff versus red flags, and how you would really be able to assess that as a parent, or even as a teacher or counselor or somebody else supporting these kids. So I give 3 examples here. So the first example, let's say your teen is anxious the night before a test. Understandable, that again is appropriate, helps motivate them, helps them study. This would be an appropriate anxiety if the anxiety goes away. So once the test is over or once the stress has passed, they're able to return to a baseline. If they are continuing to obsess about grades, compulsively checking school tool, or losing sleep over academics, that might be a little bit more of a red flag. And again, this one's a little tricky because often high achievers or people that care a lot about school, which is a positive thing, you may see a little bit of this red flag stuff. But when we're talking about anxiety that requires some intervention, it's all consuming. It's really like you can just see it affecting your child. It's all they're thinking about, talking about, and it's affecting their functioning. The second example pertains to social anxiety. So let's say your teen is self-conscious about public speaking or social interactions. Again, very appropriate as teens grow and learn in relationships, and even adults, we have this too. That's pretty typical. But if they're still able to spend time with friends and do school assignments and participate in life, then that would probably fall under the appropriate anxiety category. Now, let's say your teen starts missing school, they're sick on presentation days, or maybe they're avoiding gatherings with friends. Again, with the COVID component, that may actually be the safer thing to do, but let's say there's safe opportunities or there's Zoom things going on or FaceTime and they're tagging out from that type of thing and that's atypical for them. That may be a sign of some social anxiety. Often with young children, and we see this a bit with teens too, but you'll see those sick days becoming more frequent. That often is a sign of anxiety. Stomach aches, headaches, those things that don't really have a physical cause that you can pinpoint, but they just don't feel well a lot, that can be an indicator of anxiety. And then the third, so let's say your teen is worrying about the health of loved ones. And this, again, is very appropriate given COVID and everything that's gone on this year. But they're able to get their mind off of it and they can focus on other things. So maybe it is causing them stress and worry, but it's not to the extent that it's impeding their functioning. A red flag with this would be constantly worrying about health, frequently Googling symptoms, WebMD, all the time. And again, those physical health complaints that they might have despite going to the doctor and being told everything is fine. A lot of times that can be something that warrants a little bit more assessment and intervention just to see what else might be going on. So again, the red flag versus the typical experience can be a little bit murky and difficult, especially as a parent, to figure out, how do I know when we've reached that threshold? So things that I think about when I meet a teen in my office, these are the things that I'm questioning. How persistent are the symptoms? So how long have they been around? Is this something that, has been going on for a long time and it keeps getting worse? Or is this temporary and kind of makes sense given the circumstances? We think about how much time these things take up. So if your child is worrying all day, every day, that's concerning. That's different than periodically worrying when it kind of makes sense to, because we're always going to have some level of worry in our lives. We think about, what is the level of distress? So how upset is your teen by the way that they feel? And this may be something that as a parent, you may have to sort of gauge, because your teen may not be fully in tune with how they feel. You may just notice things that are different, like more irritable, or you may see their sleep patterns are off, or that they're moodier, which again, kind of goes along with teenage life. However, like as the parent, you might be able to see some signs that things might be progressing. And then the biggest question is, to what extent are the symptoms impacting daily functioning? So if your teen is struggling to get up, go to school, function socially, be around family, if their mood seems really off, all of that is stuff that would warrant a phone call, maybe to a therapist, just to assess and see what's going on, or even just a conversation with your teen about how they're feeling. If they, for the most part, are able to do things they normally do and the stressful periods tend to pass, then we may be talking more about typical experiences of stress. But if you're ever in doubt, I always suggest just consulting with somebody, whether the first stop be the school counselor, like talking to Joy about it, or even calling a therapist just for a consultation. It can never hurt to just get a second opinion and see what might be going on. So this slide, this is just an overview of some of the clinical anxiety disorders that I see at my practice. It's not necessarily important to know every single detail about each of these, but this might just give you a sense of some of the different types of things that we see with kids that are struggling. So the first, generalized anxiety disorder, this is that type of anxiety that is just worry about everything. The term worry wart you might think of. So the person that's always worrying about, what's going on tomorrow, 2 weeks from now, the planner, worried about health, school, money, like all of the different categories, when there's just kind of this undercurrent of worry always there, that is the generalized anxiety. Panic disorder involves panic attacks, which are really a physical experience of anxiety where your heart's beating out of your chest. People feel like they might pass out, they might throw up, they feel just like the walls are caving in. It's a very scary experience for kids and adults to go through. And they can happen randomly too. So this can be a really challenging disorder, and definitely therapy can help with that. Social anxiety, so this kind of speaks for itself. So really the fear around social interaction, feeling overly anxious, hyper aware of how other people are perceiving them, and often involves avoidance of social situations. OCD, so this one I put a star next to because I've actually had a lot of people ask me and express fear, like, will I develop OCD because of COVID and the fear of germs? So OCD, you cannot just like pick up along the way in your life. Generally speaking, you're born with some genes, some biological predisposition to OCD, and usually there is a family history. So if you look back at your family tree, you might have a parent or a grandparent that also has OCD. So unless the biological conditions are there for you to develop this, you can't get OCD from being afraid of germs. So this is really a biological, physical disorder first, and actually mental health second. So it's a little bit different than some of the other ones. And then the last one, so adjustment disorder with anxiety. This, I think we all would actually meet some diagnostic criteria this year. This is really a temporary diagnosis that just means we're under a stressful period of time, usually 6 months to a year, and we're feeling anxious. So this is something we use in the therapy world just to account for stressful things that people might be going through that might not fall under other categories. So again, just an overview, and this is sort of just a bird's eye view into what your therapist might be looking for if you're talking with them. But I always give the disclaimer that diagnosis it's important because it's a shared language across providers. It helps us identify the problem. It helps us know how to solve the problem, but it's just a piece of a person. And just because you have a diagnosis at one point in life does not mean you will have that forever. It doesn't mean that you'll always be anxious. Therapy can be very effective for anxiety. And so I'm really more interested in the whole person when I'm meeting with someone, and diagnosis is just kind of this like add-on that helps us understand a little better what is going on. So why do today's teens have more anxiety? So according to research, there's 4 main things that are contributing to this. And I'm sure there's a million more, but these are the things that seem to come up the most in different articles and different studies. So the first, again, probably no surprise, world events relative to this year, social media and smartphones, high pressure to succeed, and parenting trends. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these categories. So world events, been a tough year. COVID-19 pandemic, racial injustice, political unrest, election year, and shootings and violence on the news, even recently. That is a lot jam-packed into one year. So for kids, even though they may not intentionally regularly watch the news, they pick up on all of these things, they absorb these things, they feel what's going on. And with teens who are ultra aware of some of this, it's just been extra hard. I mean, being a teenager is hard, but then you add all of this, the online schooling, the fear around the pandemic, it's been a lot. So when we see kids that typically have anxiety and then you pile on all of this unknown, this uncertainty, I mean, all of our calendars were wiped out this year. And so not having that orientation to future and knowing what to expect has been really hard for kids and for us adults too. So I'm sure this is pretty obvious, but world events, especially this year, have really contributed to a lot of what we've seen with anxiety. The next is social media. So with the emergence of smartphones and all these new social media apps, we've seen a lot of concerning trends for teens. So the biggest problem as I see it, and from my experience when I worked in a school, it was a special education program, and my job was a lot of crisis intervention. So between the hours of like 8 and 10 every morning, most of my time was spent helping kids process and cope with drama that happened online the night before. So before, like back in my day when I was in school, or I'm sure others relate, we went to school, we dealt with the stress there of peer interactions and just all the things that went on at school. And then we came home and we got a break from that. Now kids not only have school stress, but then they have another world to manage online when they get home. And a lot happens online. And part of the challenge with that is that there's not adults that are able to manage those interactions kids are having, because what we want to give our kids some freedom. We want them to be able to talk to their friends, but all of this happens in the absence of teachers or counselors or people that can kind of help kids navigate that. So they're doing it on their own more, and then it becomes a lot more stressful for them. So it's a really tricky position as a parent to figure out what is that line. A lot of cyberbullying happens online, increased comparison. So there's all the filters and these apps that make your face look different. I mean, it really, especially for young girls, gives this unrealistic idea of beauty and what people should look like. And And then less sleep. So kids are on their phone a lot. I've noticed with the kids I've seen over the years, there's sleep schedules just seem really different. Like there's no like go to bed at 9 o'clock anymore. It's like kids are FaceTiming till 3 a.m, just constantly in communication. And when kids get less sleep, they are more prone to anxiety and depression and lots of other mental health symptoms. So social media isn't necessarily all bad, and technology, thankfully, has allowed for connection, especially in COVID, but it does put increased stress on our teens to be navigating all of that. So the next category is high pressure to succeed. So there's a lot of pressure on kids nowadays with this culture of achievement, rigorous standardized testing, and then comparison on social media again. So there's these trends where kids are posting college acceptance posts, and that can make some kids feel bad if they didn't get into their ideal college. Again, there's just a lot more comparison that can happen. And this is a tricky one because we would like our kids to be motivated, and it's a positive thing to care about achievement and doing well and wanting to succeed. But the bar, according to studies, shows that the bar gets higher and higher, and a lot of kids put a sense of self-worth, perhaps a little too much, into their grades on standardized tests and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to navigate that, but essentially, our work becomes helping kids see themselves as well-rounded and being able to make realistic goals for education or career, and seeing multiple paths to get there so that it doesn't feel like so much pressure with just one particular way. So this one, helicopter parenting. So this word you may have heard. I want to just start by first acknowledging what this is and then the good intentions behind it. So we have seen trends in parents being very involved in a loving way, in a well-meaning way, to help their kids succeed. And what sometimes ends up happening is that kids are not building the independent skills that they need when we go a little too far over that line. So the good intentions, let's start there. We want our kids to succeed. We want to support them. We want to love them, and our efforts to be involved are all very well-meaning. However, these things do have unintended consequences. So we may see kids struggle to problem solve on their own. They might miss out on developmentally appropriate challenges that could help build resiliency, and kids end up being a little bit less independent into the adolescent phase, and adolescence can extend a little further into the 20s. And there can also be more social anxiety too. So if kids are not used to solving their own problems or approaching a teacher themselves to work out a concern, they might miss out on the opportunity to build that confidence. So we'll talk a little bit more about this and how we can both support our kids and also challenge them to be a little bit more independent too. So those are the things that are contributing to anxiety, just a few. And then let's get into the part that is helpful. So how parents can support their teens with anxiety. So in my practice, I'm going to speak a bit just anecdotally on things that I have observed to be really helpful, and also some activities and some research around what can be really useful. So we'll go over how to help kids claim a sense of control. So we'll do this locus of control activity, help our kids increase tolerance of uncertainty. This is very relevant, especially in today's times with COVID and all that is unknown. We'll talk about how to help kids approach feared things rather than avoiding them. So we actually know that avoidance strengthens anxiety. And we'll also talk about how to foster independence and more problem solving. So these are all things that are really important to help kids manage anxiety. So this is a worksheet that I often do with families. It's called the locus of control. So when people are anxious, it feels like everything is out of their control. Like there's nothing that they can do to keep control of their anxious thoughts. And with COVID, this has been a really big problem for us. So one thing that I often do with kids and sometimes with parents there too is identify 3 different categories. We'll pull the sheet out, and first we'll write down, what are some things outside of my control? So identifying with COVID, for instance, I can't control other people's actions. I can't control how long this virus will be around. I can't control the vaccine rollout. I can't control that I might miss out on some things. So just the step of identifying things we can't control can actually be relieving because we get to put it all out there. It takes it out of our body, puts it on the paper, and it can just be really helpful. The next thing we do is talk about what can I control? So what things each day do I have power over? How I take care of myself, who I interact with, what choices I make, what things I focus on, what things make me feel good. So this step can sort of just bring into awareness things that we might not be consciously thinking about that can help us. And then step 3 is talking about how are we going to cope with the things that I can't control? So there might be things we can't do anything about, but let's talk about how we're going to manage that. And this activity is something like with some clients, we do this every week because the target might change each week. We might be dealing with a whole different set of circumstances based on what's going on in the world or in our lives. So repeatedly doing this and identifying these things can be really empowering and help reclaim some of that power back from the anxiety. So for the coping strategy piece of that, I break this down into 3 categories. So when we talk about anxiety, anxiety affects both body and mind, and we really have to treat both. So the first thing we want to think about is how do I calm my body down? And these are just some examples of things that can help. So physical outlets, breathing exercises, and also grounding through our senses. So especially with people with panic attacks, we talk about ways to just bring that stress response down and ground into the present. So maybe taking ice cubes and rubbing those on the temple, or taking a spicy piece of gum and popping it in your mouth. That can just help bring you out of the panic mind and into your body. Calming the mind, so doing things that are nourishing for your mind. So music, spending time with people, either virtually or in person, and doing things that we enjoy. And then the third, so I put a star next to this because I have seen this actually become probably one of the most challenging things for people this year, and the most relevant is finding meaning, purpose, and a sense of future. So when we don't feel like there's a future that we can see, and when all of our events are wiped off the calendar and we don't know what tomorrow looks like, that's very traumatizing. And a lot of people experienced that in a very difficult way this year, and we still are. So what I have found to be really helpful for teens especially is finding ways to orient themselves in time. So thinking about the future and also connecting current things that they are doing to future goals. So some examples of how to keep a sense of future. A lot of teens I work with, they might set a countdown app on their phone for things that are coming up that they're looking forward to, even maybe small things. Making a vision board. So, some type of crafty activity where you print off some things from Pinterest about places you want to go or vacations you want to plan, just keeping a sense of things to look forward to. And then linking current activities to future goals. So especially with school, if you're working with, let's say, an older teen, that they might know what they want to do when they get older. They might want to go to med school per se. But maybe they're feeling really unmotivated with academics currently because it's just been a hard year. So continuing to link how what your teen is doing now is going to help them in the future can again be very orienting and grounding. So the second category for things we can do to help is tolerance of uncertainty. So there's actually a misconception around anxiety and the idea that we have to convince ourselves nothing bad will happen in order to reduce anxiety. And the opposite is actually true. So the more that we can tolerate uncertainty and accept the reality that life always involves risks, the less anxious we start to feel. So the key becomes teaching our kids and ourselves that we can handle whatever challenges do come our way. This sounds difficult, and it is, because thinking about risk and life involving risk is really challenging. But the more that we can have that acceptance and know, I can't know for certain nothing bad will happen. I can do the best I can to make the right choices every day. And then here's how I'm going to cope with different challenges. That is much more helpful than constantly reassuring it's all going to be okay. Because sometimes we can't assure that, especially this year as parents navigating the uncertainty of COVID ourselves. It's important to have that honesty about this is part of life, but here's how we're going to deal with it. Here's how we can work through that. So affirmations are something that I really like. These work really well for kids if they like to draw or put things on sticky notes. I have some of my teens, they'll write these things down and put them in places they'll see. So maybe on their laptop or on their mirror, or places that they look at when they get up in the morning. So some affirmations to help increase this tolerance for uncertainty. Reminding yourself that I can take things one day, hour, and minute at a time. I can focus on what's going right today and cope with tomorrow when it arrives. Uncertainty can actually bring positive outcomes too. So there might be good things that we don't know about. I trust in my ability to take the next right step when facing a challenge. I have done hard things before and I can do them again. And I have supportive people in my life to help me with challenges. So all of these affirmations can be really helpful to dealing with uncertainty and increasing the confidence to handle that. So the next strategy involves approaching fears as opposed to avoiding them. So what you see here is called the anxiety feedback loop. So when we avoid our fears, we might temporarily feel better, but this actually strengthens our anxiety over time. So we might have a situation, I'll use a social anxiety example. Let's say your teen is preparing to go back to school. So actually, in some other districts where they've been out of school for a while, there's been some teens that have been very anxious about that, just returning to social situations. Or maybe it's your teens starting to see friends a little more outside of school, and it feels overwhelming because they haven't really done that in a while. So they might feel that social anxiety, which brings up the stress response. So that cortisol, that heart pounding, that nervousness, and the gut reaction might be, okay, I'm going to avoid that so I don't have to deal with that. And that temporarily brings the stress down, but it actually reinforces the fear, and then there's negative consequences. So missing out on fun, or the longer that your teen is away from those situations, the less inclined they feel to return to them. So the more that we avoid our fear, the stronger this loop gets. So what we want to do is actually talk about ways to progressively face our fears within what we call the working zone or window of tolerance. So this is where we can push ourselves just enough to where it's not too overwhelming, but we feel we can be successful and then increase our confidence. So this loop ends up looking a little different. So there might be the anxiety trigger, the stress might go up, but instead of avoiding, we use some coping skills, we take some deep breaths, we use some affirmations, we approach the situation that we fear, and this ends up rewiring the neural pathways in our brain. And over time, we'll feel less anxious. So one thing I always tell the teens that I work with, and they don't believe me at the beginning, is that when I say okay, we're going to approach some of these things, they're like, no, I'm not doing that. But I explain this to them, and that the brain actually changes, our bodies actually change. So if they keep doing the hard thing, they're not going to feel as anxious over time. And it's always really cool, let's say 6 months or maybe a year in, when kids look back and they're like, I can't believe I was afraid of that before. So doing these things really work, and it can be really empowering and increase kids' confidence to be pushed a little towards those things that they fear. So the last part of how parents can support, so really trying to foster independence and problem solving. So according to Columbia University, 25 has been coined as the new 18. So like I'd mentioned at the beginning, we're seeing adolescence extend a bit longer than it did in the past. And part of that is if kids don't have enough opportunities to fail and fall down and get back up and work through things on their own, they become a bit too reliant on their caregivers. So what we really know is that kids become confident and self-sufficient adults when they have more opportunities to problem solve and work through challenges. So how do we do this? I mean, as parents, we want to help our kids. We want them to succeed. We want to jump in and maybe rescue them sometimes. But what actually is more helpful is to support our teens by giving guidance, a listening ear, ideas about how to navigate problems, and then putting them in the driver's seat to take action. So an example of this, maybe your teen is upset with a teacher or somebody else in their life that communication didn't go well or something happened. Rather than taking the lead on emailing the teacher, you might encourage your teen to reach out to them first and see how they can problem solve and find a solution on their own. And you can give them ideas, but really empower them to do so. In my practice, what this looks like is I might have kids come in and they're upset with their parents or something happened at home. And, depending on the circumstance, I often try to encourage the teen to work with me on figuring out how they can talk to their parent about that rather than me emailing or calling it. I want them to learn those communication skills and to learn to problem solve. So ultimately, failure breeds learning. It's okay for kids to struggle, and that is going to help them build resiliency. So in some ways, I hope that hearing about this helps take you off the hook a little bit as a parent to know that it is okay for your kids to be upset sometimes if something doesn't go well or, to experience a failure. And we're there to help them work through that and to teach them and guide them. But the more that they can learn that in stages on their own, the better off they'll be when they do go to college and enter adult life. So the final part of this, so how can therapy help teens with anxiety? So there's really four key components that I do at my practice, and a lot of therapists who work with anxious teens also do. So the gold standard for anxiety therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy, which essentially helps kids to identify what makes them anxious, dispute unhelpful or irrational thoughts. So maybe this might look like constantly catastrophizing or making assumptions or jumping into the future instead of focusing on what's going on right now. We look at all of those things and figure out some more helpful ways to approach those challenges rather than jumping to conclusions. And ultimately, this type of therapy helps teens gain control over thoughts and emotions. So what we do is we pair this with mindfulness and coping skills. So it's really important for kids to learn how to control what's going on within their body because anxiety lives in the body. So we work on relaxation strategies, breathing exercises, muscle relaxation, and just how to regulate and identify emotions. So both of these are really important parts of therapy. Exposure therapy. So this is what we're talking about in terms of that anxiety feedback loop and working on creating opportunities to approach things we fear. So we do this in a hierarchy. I've worked with some teens who have pretty intense phobias, maybe a fear of the doctor is an example I've seen a few times. So we're not going to have them, jump right into the hardest situation when there's a lot of anxiety there. So maybe not going to the doctor, but we might first start by visualizing being in the doctor's office and then using those coping skills to bring the anxiety down. The next step might be going with their parent and just sitting in the parking lot in the car, feeling the anxiety rise and then using the skills to bring it back down. We slowly work our way up to the big stuff so that kids can gain that confidence along the way to approach things that make them anxious. And then the final piece is just holistic approaches to health. So boundaries around screen time, learning about the mind and body connection, things that make us feel good, time spent in nature, self-care, all of those things are really important too. So Really what I say to parents is if you ever just have concerns about anxiety or what you see going on with your kid, it can never hurt to just reach out for a consultation again with a therapist or talk, maybe starting with your school counselor, Joy. It's always a good place to just get some ideas, even if you as the parent just want to go in yourself and talk and get some ideas and feedback. So final thoughts. I just want to give parents a little encouragement because it's been a hard year and this is a lot of information, and it can also increase pressure to feel urgency around fixing all of it. So I want to just validate that parenting is a really hard job. We're going to make a lot of mistakes as parents. This is part of parenthood. You are under a lot of pressure. It's been a very hard year. And we really aren't meant to be everything for our kids. It does take a village. So being okay with asking yourself, who else can help support my teen? Teachers, therapists, family, friends, the list goes on. Allowing yourself to receive help and giving yourself permission to tag out and take care of yourself when you need to. So healthy parent means healthy kid. If you're taking care of your anxiety and stress, that's going to help them in the long run. So it's okay sometimes if you just need to call in a therapist to do this work with your kid. If you don't have the bandwidth or the knowledge, that's completely okay. And therapy is also for parents too. So don't hesitate to reach out for your own needs as well. So these are just some resources. Connecting with a therapist, psychologytoday.com is a good place to start. You can search therapists in your area or speaking with your school counselor or pediatrician. I've listed some books on here that are really good ones for anxiety. And if you have questions for me, again, that you can ask them in the chat now, or if you don't get to it now, you can always email me or give me a call, and I'm happy to connect with you then as well. So that is all that I have. So I think next step is getting into some questions.
Thanks, Barb. Did you stop sharing so I could maybe, well, doesn't matter. So we have, first of all, thank you so much. That was such a great wealth of information and just so well planned. So thank you. I think a lot of parents and faculty and just adults need to hear a lot of those. And the affirmation, your little affirmation got me a little teary. I'm like, yes, we are doing the best we can. Thank you. Sometimes we don't hear it enough, you know? So we have one question so far. With many therapists not taking on new patients, what are your thoughts on online therapy?
So with online therapy, I mean, a lot of therapists are doing that and have been this year. So is that the question? What are my thoughts on?
I think they might be referring more to, is it called Talkspace, or those larger therapy groups that you might see advertised? Like, I'm thinking of the one like Michael Phelps, you know,
okay.
those larger, I'm trying to say feeders.
Yep. So I actually know there are a lot of therapists that are in private practice or might work for an agency and then do Talkspace or something of that nature on the side. So it's a challenge to find therapists with openings. I totally just want to validate that. And I think those like Talkspace, I think those are perfectly acceptable things to research and look into. I think what's most important is once you get connected to a therapist, just, investigating their credentials a little bit, asking them about their practice, what they specialize in, making sure you feel it's a good fit. But I know plenty of therapists that are in this area that do Talkspace too. So I think it's a legitimate way to get help. I think you just want to do your research and just make sure you feel good about the connection and, learn. It's, you want to interview your therapist. You want to know what, how's this person going to help me? And I think that's the most important part. So I definitely think that's a good resource.
I have another question. So what can a parent expect when they take their child that maybe is younger, let's say 11 to 13-year-old? What can I expect from, your conversations with my child? And as a parent, what will I be privy to? How do you work with the parent, but also building trust also with the child?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, especially with younger kids, kind of in that age range, um, the way that I do things, so I like to bring in parent and child together for the first session and get to know the family as a whole. So I hear from parents about their perspective on what is going on, and then I talk with the child a bit about what they think is going on. And really, how I do things is I work individually with the child for the most part. So we'll have our weekly sessions, but then we bring the parent in every couple weeks to do some joint work too. So
Yep.
what the kids, I let the kids and parents know everything that is said to me by the child is confidential unless it involves safety. So risk of harming themselves or something really major that, a parent should know about their kids' physical health and well-being. But I might encourage, let's say the child is bringing something up to me that they're concerned about or that I think would help the parent to know. I'll just say to the child, can we talk about this with mom and dad? And how can we do that in a way that's comfortable to you? And do you want to do that? Or do you want me to start? Like I plan it with the child and then we talk all together. So generally, I really don't have kids often refuse that. So we try to pull the parent in as often as makes sense. And I always like parents to feel like there's an open door to ask me questions, but we do keep a level of transparency with where the child will know that we're talking because trust is important. In order for the child to really open up, they have to know that some of what they share will stay there.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that teen suicidal hospitalizations have doubled in the last decade. I'm wondering, at what age do you feel it's appropriate to talk with children about possible thoughts of self-harm or suicide? I know it depends upon the child, but do you have a general recommendation?
That's a really good one. I would say that it's going to depend on your child, but if you are seeing some signs that are concerning, like even in young kids as young as let's say 8 or 9, if your child seems really depressed or maybe like you're seeing their Google searches and some things are coming up that are a little bit alarming, like I hear this from parents that they'll see kids research like suicide or self-harm or things like that. If you're starting to see things like that, I think you definitely address it sooner than later and explain, sometimes kids have different thoughts about things that are really upsetting and let's talk about that. I think I would recommend with young ones, like if you're seeing the red flags, that's when you might want to start. But kids, it's all out there. Kids talk about this stuff with each other. They have access to social media. They have access to this information. So I think when in doubt, have the open conversation. And if you're not sure how to do that exactly, that's where a counselor to help navigate that is a great place. And even your pediatrician, I mean, they talk about these things with kids too. So that's another great place to go. So yeah, I know that doesn't fully answer it, but I think it depends on your child.
Right.
And, I think if you're seeing signs that concern you, it's better to err on the side of talking about it.
Have you found in your experience that limiting screen time helps reduce anxiety? And if so, does this apply overall, including like talking with friends or just watching shows and playing video games?
So I have seen some kids that before like screen time was out of control. I mean, like the numbers that they would tell me of the hours they're on per day, I was like, my jaw's on the floor. I'm trying to act cool, but I was like, what? So with some of these kids, what I've worked with them on is if they've identified this as a goal, then we talk about screen time and how to bring that down. And some kids have said like they feel a lot better when they're not on their phones all the time. I definitely think it helps reduce anxiety. It's tricky because there has to be buy-in. So I think we have to kind of have our child or our teens see that there's something that doesn't feel quite right. And then we sort of try to lead them there. And replacing that with other entertaining things, that can be tricky in these times, but I think there have to be outlets that they are interested in to replace that. What was the second part of it with the video?
So it's more, I think there's screen time, right? Which I think of like social media, video games, Candy Crush versus like FaceTiming with friends. So if your kids are always on the phone, you get that little reminder, your screen time increased, which was frightening. I turned mine off. But, like, so is anxiety linked with, social media and the games, or should we link in, FaceTiming with friends with that as well, or not? Did I make?
I would say FaceTiming with friends is linked to an extent, because that kind of starts to get into this topic of boundaries. And I think kids, their boundaries are really confusing when they're on their phone all the time. So they don't know when is it me time to relax and wind down and center. And I think FaceTime becomes tricky, because if they're always on that, they lose that sense of boundary. So I would say all parts of it probably connect to anxiety. I would recommend really, addressing all parts. But I think the social media aspect and what goes on there and kind of those addictive things that's probably the one you want to target first. And then the FaceTime boundary stuff might be like second in order, I guess.
Thank you very much. Participants, we have about 5 minutes left. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to add them into chat. Just gonna wait just a little bit. I have a quick question. You gave signs for anxiety, if they're perseverating on ideas, are there other things that might be signs of anxiety that maybe are a little more, I guess, not unusual, but aren't clear, direct links to anxiety, but perhaps we should be attuned to?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say, the obvious ones are the perseveration, the worry. I think, again, the physical complaints, like if there's a lot of stomach aches, headaches, things like that, that is always kind of a red flag to me about anxiety.
Right. This year, I've seen an increase in lack of motivation. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm wondering how you see that play a role in anxiety or another, issue that might teens be deal with, because anxiety lack of motivation is a huge one I see.
I see lack of motivation a lot too in my practice. And what I see more with that is more depression. It can definitely accompany anxiety too. Like if there's just so much overwhelm that there's like that shutdown. But with lack of motivation, lack of purpose, just not feeling like they want to do anything, that typically is what concerns me more with feeling depressed.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of that this year. And I think remembering too, that some of this is hopefully a sign of the times and what we're all going through now, and that eventually the hope that life will get better and we'll resume some semblance of normalcy. I think we will see some of these things start to get better. But the lack of motivation, I definitely feel depression is more closely linked for that.
Thank you. Are anxiety medications resources for teens? Like, I guess, what are your thoughts on medications for anxiety?
So anxiety is one of those things that it's a little bit difficult to treat with straight medicine. So what I usually recommend, and I work in tandem with some nurse practitioners and psychiatrists, where we collaborate, so that's really their domain, but we generally try to work in therapy first on the skills and understanding what's going on and lifestyle changes and just talking about things. If that's not working, then we look at medicine. So that might be something that is sort of like the second line of defense for teens. It's kind of hit or miss whether or not it's effective. So I think medicine comes into play a little bit more urgently when there's panic attacks happening, because there are medicines that are more fast acting and directly address that. But in terms of the chronic anxiety, generally therapy is more effective than medicine for that. And if therapy is not working, pairing it with the therapy can be helpful, but I wouldn't usually recommend just medicine, because then the underlying parts aren't really addressed.
Last question, and thank you very much. By asking children if they're anxious or sad or thinking of hurting themselves, do we risk traumatizing them or causing them to become anxious or sadder when they wouldn't have been otherwise? So does talking about or asking about them create the feeling?
Really good question. There actually is research on this. And Research has found that no, asking them about it does not create those feelings. If they're thinking about it already, that's going to prompt them to talk about it. So asking a teen if they feel suicidal or if they feel like self-harming or if they feel anxious is not going to make them suddenly think, hey, like, I think I'm going to start feeling that way. Like, that just doesn't really happen. I ask about those things all the time in my practice. And it honestly, I think, helps kids to feel more like it's okay to talk about that. And if they do feel that way at some point, the foundation is there where they know it's not this taboo thing to speak about. So I speak very directly. I use the words like suicide. Do you feel like killing yourself? Like, I say those things. I don't sugarcoat them at all. And at first kids are like, whoa, like, okay, this is a little different. But over time, that has opened up conversations that were really important and needed to happen. So no, you're not going to create those feelings. I always think it's better to ask and just double check and be sure.
Wonderful. Well, Barb, thank you very much. Thank you for participants for joining us and asking such wonderful questions. Really appreciate all the participants coming and giving Barb our attention. You're just such a great resource, I know, for me and for our MPH community. And this will be recorded, so we'll sending this off to the community again. I know that you'll probably be getting a lot of questions, Barb. So
well, feel free to reach out. If you don't hear from me, it means I'm in labor. So I won't get back to you so long as the baby is not here yet. But
oh my
thank
gosh,
you for having me. It was great to be here and connect with you all. And definitely reach out if there's anything that comes up that you want to chat more about.
Wonderful. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it all, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Barb and Joy. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.